we're just going to bring in Oliver McTernan. He's a director at the think tank Forward Thinking. Oliver, thank you so much for taking the time to speak to us today on France 24. First of all, what does this hostage deal, reveal about the balance of power between Israel and Hamas?
Well, the balance is asymmetric from the beginning, but a resistance group always has, I think, the upper hand on the governing power because they have a sort of community to operate within. We certainly saw this in Northern Ireland. But I think the present situation, all the comments that we're hearing about the ceasefire ending at the end of this first stage, I find that deeply disturbing.
And how do you think, how might this exchange influence future negotiations between Israel and Hamas?
Well, it's very interesting to compare what we've just witnessed, this big demonstration by Hamas of defiance. Now, go back to November 2023, when we saw the first exchange that took place at night, was a much more discreet, modest affair, and no big demonstration of power. I think what we're witnessing this morning is a fact that I've been trying to communicate in the last 15 months. Basically, that a military approach increases resistance. I don't think Hamas is an ideology. I think Hamas is essentially a resistance movement. And as long as occupation continues, the cause of resistance will continue. What Hamas does, as opposed to other Palestinian resistance movements, it has an Islamic reference. It's like in previous the situation in Britain when the IRA were operating, they always had a reference to the just war theory to justify their actions. So I think if we keep that in mind, the message, and it was clear today from Gaza, Hamas saying, we're here and we're not going away. And I think the message I'm getting from Gaza of non-Hamas people who are really anxious about now and how they will move forward, how they will govern Gaza, is the message of inclusiveness. There is no future without inclusiveness, and in particular, in some way, incorporating the current police and security in Gaza into a future inclusive government. And I think that's the right step.
You said that Hamas is not an ideology, it's more of a resistance movement. Bearing this in mind, are there any ethical dilemmas in negotiating with Hamas?
Well, I think I really don't understand that, because the goal is to find, or should be, to find a solution to break this cycle of violence. Now, when I did the Shalit deal, I clearly got the message. And in explaining this, I would very clearly say I don't endorse it. But the message that I passed over to the Israeli negotiators at the time was basically the reason why Hamas focused on taking Israeli soldiers was to force a review of lifers in Israeli prisons. Apparently, there was one stage when all cases could be up for review. So someone with 99 years or 100 or 990 years prison sentence could have their case go through a judicial review. Since that practice was abolished, the art was to force reviews by holding soldiers hostage. Now, in explaining that, let me stress, I don't endorse it. But unless we get rationality and we see that the root cause of what we're witnessing is the ongoing occupation, the deprivation of an independent Palestinian state, not just Gaza, but West Bank and East Jerusalem as well, what is internationally recognized, unless we spend political capital and trying to sort of see that that is established without further delay, then I fear the cycle of violence will go on. And what we're witnessing, sadly, today is another pageant. And it will lead eventually, whether it be in 6 weeks' time or whatever, it'll lead to another outbreak of violence in some direction. Today, it may be the name Hamas. Tomorrow, it'll be some other organization, but within the Palestinian community and arising from the core problem, which is occupation.
Oliver, I have with me in the studio on set with me Shirley Sitbon from our International Affairs Desk, and she'd like to ask you a question.
Yes, hello. With the new administration in the U.S., we've heard some comments from people picked by Donald Trump, including his pick for the UN, the next perhaps the next U.S. ambassador to the UN, his nominee, Elise Stefanik, who said that for her, well, basically Israel has a biblical right, that's her word, over the West Bank, and they wanted the destruction of the Hamas entirely. That kind of speech, that kind of rhetoric. How do you see that type of administration, who is the administration who forced Netanyahu to take this current deal, how do you see it moving along and pushing what you were talking about? Is something inclusive possible with that type of administration? What kind of solutions can they bring?
You've asked me a very difficult question, because I think that the two levels of answer. Right at the beginning of the Israeli response to October the 7th, I met in the Knesset and also in Hebron various factions of the different factions of the Israeli government. Now, then there were people who held firmly that October the 7th was an opportunity to introduce what they call the Third Commonwealth. They said the First Commonwealth was around Solomon formed the tribes in Hebron. David established the temple, you had the Jewish kingdom, and now they've waited 2,000 years for this opportunity to see from the river to the sea a Jewish state fulfilling the biblical promises. Now, I think that has been, I think, a driving ideology or belief, I would say, in Israel, in the political circles since the beginning of this war. And I think I don't know how much Netanyahu himself would buy into that, but I think it is one of the problems that has to be addressed. And of course, they were surprised that there wasn't a Judeo Christian alliance to fulfill this dream. Their goal was to see deportation of all Palestinians. Now, and as I say, I've had that explained to me several times. Alongside that, I think in the Trump administration, yes, he's brought in people who would go along with this biblical vision. But he has also, I think the good thing about Trump, he is transactional. He's probably the first American president in my lifetime who is naked in his intentions. He doesn't talk or dress himself up in principles, international law, defense of people's rights. He looks at things in transactional terms, what is in the best interest of America. And it was once explained to me by a senior CIA analyst when Obama was about to take the White House. He said, look, when you're looking at the Middle East, keep one thing in mind. America's policy is determined by interest. Interests are domestic, and domestic interests can be summed up in one word, the economy. And I think when I look at it, I think that is a real thing. So I see a mixed message coming out of the Trump White House. If Saudi Arabia keeps to its word and says there's no way we're going to normalize in the way that we would all hope to see in the region, if they say the price for normalization is a full Palestinian state, then I think we could see a significant change maybe in the Trump period in the White House.
Oliver, how do you see then the swap shaping politics in both Israel and Gaza going forward?
There's a lot of, if we talk about Gaza first, long before October 7th, there was discussion in Gaza that Hamas should give up the administration It should be more inclusive. There was talk in August 2023 of municipal elections. I sat in communes in meetings where all the factions were represented, and there was a strong belief that they should have a common agenda. So it didn't matter who won the municipal election, that common agenda should be implemented together. I'm getting that from the same people who took part in that meeting. I'm getting that very strong message. Now, these are not Hamas people that don't support Hamas, but they are seeing in Gaza the only future is a basically inclusive future. And of course, people would want that extended to include Ramallah and the Palestinian Authority. A lot of work has to be done on that. I think Israel, the biggest existential crisis or threat, I think, to Israel is internal. I think there are fundamental differences within Israel that this ongoing conflict hasn't allowed them to address. So I would hope that there would be, coming out of this conflict, a new Israeli leadership, and I think that is possible, that will see not in the immediate terms of what's in my best interest or political interest, but will see the long-term interest of Israel. It has to be an integral part of the region, but to achieve that, it has to develop, I think, good, solid relationships with the Palestinian people.
Another question for you. Many thought that Hamas would be extremely weakened when Hezbollah came almost crushing down its leadership, when the Syrian regime, Bashar al-Assad, was brought down. Do you think it has had an effect now on Hamas several weeks after several months, as far as Hezbollah is concerned? Do you think it has an effect on its specific, power in Gaza and its standing in Gaza?
I think what has impacted on Hamas more than anything has been the disastrous consequences of October the 7th. There were people in Hamas who profoundly disagreed with what happened. On the first, about a week into this war, way back in the end of October, got a clear message from Doha. I was in Doha, got a clear message that some felt taking civilian hostages was not within the moral, ethical codes or legal codes, and therefore there was an offer to hand back 139 civilian hostages without any precondition, provided there would be a space, a truce, where those could be collected and exchanges could be made. Now, understandably, I took that message to a very traumatized Israel, that people at that stage weren't listening. But the consequences of the war and the devastation in Gaza, I think, has in some way, made people think, well, we need a sort of new approach, and it's encouraged inclusiveness. The idea of Hamas or any other Palestinian being proxies either of Iran or linked with Hezbollah. Of course, there were alliances, I would say, of convenience. There were ways, but certainly people are forgetting that with Assad, there was a rift between Assad and Hamas for nearly 8 or 9 years. When the Arab Spring happened, they took a Sunni position, clear Sunni position, and withdrew from Damascus, and became, for that reason, Assad saw them as almost an enemy, not sort of proxy. So I think there's a lot of analysis going around, which, if you've been around the region for a bit of a while, I think you realize, hey, that needs further scrutiny to get the real picture.
And I wonder, how is the role of Egypt and Qatar being perceived in Gaza?
Well, I think everyone appreciates what they have done in helping to get this a pause, at least, in the fighting, and give people a breathing space in what's been a living nightmare for the past 15 months. I think both of them will play an important role in helping to see that the ceasefire continues. It's certainly in Egypt's interest to see that there is some sort of progress made. I think what is needed, though, is taking the Palestinians seriously as an actor in their own rights. It took the British, English in particular, 800 years to come to the realization that they could only deal with the conflict on the island of Ireland, which they were an integral part, through an inclusive dialogue. It always attempted to solve the problem either through military means, or if it took a political position, it always was top down. You chose your interlocutors and you imposed a solution. It was only when the realization came, you have to have at the table everyone who has real constituency, that you move forward to a process that can deliver durable solutions. And that's been our experience with the Good Friday Agreement. I think that is very, very relevant in the Israeli-Palestinian situation. For the past 14 years now, we've been taking Israeli politicians over to Belfast and Dublin to get the insights of people who were an integral part of that process in Ireland. And they do realize there are real insights. But as it took time in Ireland for people to have the political courage to act on those insights, and in particularly to lead their constituencies and not be led by focus groups and the mood of the constituency at any one time. I think until we get that mindset change, I think sadly, as I say, this cycle of violence will continue.